AI and the Propaganda of Abstracting Isolation, How to Explain Away Evil Purposes. Bruce Charlton. A post by Francis Berger brought into focus a common propaganda tactic to which I must invent a term: abstracting isolation. The basic idea is that something harmful being introduced, some new and bad policy, or some strategic plan of evil, is explained away, is talked into neutrality or insignificance, and this is achieved by the tactic of drawing a line around it, thereby abstracting it from the actual situation and process in which it is encountered. I have repeatedly seen this at every level of life. In the university workplace, management, on instruction from government, would introduce some bureaucratic change that always took power from academics and transferred it to management. Yet another in the unending stream of schemes for monitoring and control of academics and students. The latest step in a successful strategy pursued over many years, a strategy of incremental managerial bureaucratic takeover. But, this latest change was always abstracted from the strategy and from the big picture. In effect, a line was drawn around the new task or policy. We were made to consider the change as if it was an isolated entity, coming from nowhere except the earnest desire for functional improvement that we all know characterizes management, and going nowhere in particular, and especially not any kind of power grab. Only a delusional nut job could imagine such a ludicrous notion as a planned government management takeover. As such, the new thing always seemed neutral, trivial, nothing to get upset about, nothing to make a fuss about, unless you are neurotic or paranoid. And yet at the same time, this neutral, trivial, nothing was also, somehow, essential, important, and, bottom line, mandatory. We had to do it. Or else. And because we had to do it or else, then we might as well make the best of it. Indeed, we might as well pretend that this is a good thing. Or, at least, a thing with great potential for good, if only people would stop wasting their time complaining about the inevitable, and instead take a positive and constructive attitude about using the thing, whatever it happened to be, in the best possible way. At the end of this line of rhetoric, the trivial, isolated, neutral policy or technology has become a boon, with the help of well-motivated staff who, instead of moaning and dragging their feet, will rise to the challenge of this new opportunity. Who will, by their optimistic attitudes and hard work, ensure that the best possible outcomes will happen, and any problems will be solved. If only people would give this thing the benefit of the doubt, then it could become a great gift, a tool with vast potential for those with goodwill to use in generating all kinds of positive possibilities. Phew. All this from an abstractly isolated neutral technological tool. All this merely from its being implemented by people of goodwill and positive intent to do good, as we can, of course, assume it will be implemented, the leadership positions of the world being almost exclusively inhabited by such saints. Luckily, we almost never see technologies actually, in the real world, mega-exploited almost exclusively for their worst capabilities, so we needn't concern ourselves with that sort of difficulty. This with AI, what is actually emanating as an incremental change from a top-down, terra-dollar-funded, decades-long globalist, totalitarian strategy, aiming at bureaucratic omni-surveillance and micro-control of mass thought and behavior, aiming at the imposition of a materialist perspective and assuming the irrelevance and insignificance of God, Jesus Christ and the spiritual. By a simple act of abstracting isolation, AI has been transformed into a vital tool that shall be used, mostly, for the betterment of humankind and this world, to stand in the path of which outcome is both futile and misguided, if not worse. The spiritual harm of AI is this pretending, and convincing oneself, that purposive evil is good, and indeed ought to be regarded as good simply because we cannot, or will not, resist it. If you really think about it, evil can be good. If only we regard it with a calm, reasonable, properly informed, and nuanced attitude. Such is one of the greatest and most effective big lies of our era. And, like all effective lies, it contains an element of truth. Which is that within a vast strategy for generic evil, there is indeed potential to go against the current, to some extent, and for a while but not permanently, and do some particular good. True. But that truth does not affect the purposively evil nature of the general strategy. Discernment is vital for Christians, to know evil in order that we may affiliate to good. It is all quite simple to know, difficult/impossible to do in the material world, but always possible to hold fast onto as our spiritual intention. Our possibilities for doing good despite evil, should never lead us to choosing allegiance with the strategies of evil. Uncreated freedom is not an uncreated form we share with God. Francis Berger. A while back, Krista of the Authorsphere wrote a post in which he surprisingly toyed with and then acknowledged the reality of uncreated freedom. The acknowledgement made quite an impression on me at the time, but I resisted responding to the post for the simple reason that my interactions with Krista or his ideas have rarely been constructive or, for my part, pleasant. Anyway, I forgot about the post after that, but it recently came back to me, and I have decided to respond to it, not with the intention of sparking another fruitless debate, or debunking Krista's assumptions. Instead, I see this more as a sharing of my assumptions on what I believe uncreated freedom to be and how and why these differ from Krista's assumptions. That's it. Make of it what you will. Krista's post in italics.
Francis asserted that our creaturely freedom is uncreate, that we too must therefore be uncreate, and that if we or our freedom are created, then our freedom is inauthentic, or unreal, not true freedom.
I am unsure what creaturely freedom refers to, however, I do assume that freedom is uncreated. I base this belief on the assumption that beings are fundamental. Beings not only comprise creation, they are creation. Beings are eternal, everlasting in the sense that they exist and have always existed in time. God, who is a being among beings, formed these beings into creation. Freedom is an inherent part of all beings. Thus, God molded or formed beings into creation, but did not and could not mold or form the freedom inherent in all beings.
I disagreed, pointing out difficulties and absurdities that arise from the notion that there are many uncreate beings, or that we are such beings, and arguing that, despite our creation, in which we had no part, creatures are real through and through, including our freedom.
The difficulties and absurdities alluded to only arise when the assumptions posited are approached through the lens of another set of assumptions that asserts things like creatio ex nihilo. Beings are fundamentally uncreated, yet in creation they could be classified as uncreated created beings. Put another way, pre-existing beings provided with other properties, but their inherent and innate freedom remained largely intact.
I continue to think I am right about all that, but, while I am in no doubt that we are not eternal, for I apprehend that I am changing this very minute, I still found myself ruminating over the last few weeks about whether our freedom is indeed uncreate.
Once again, for me, eternal means everlasting, not unchanging.
I think it is, even though we are not, and that despite that we are temporal, contingent creatures, and despite the fact that we are thoroughly caused, so that there is sufficient reason that we are as we find that we are, our freedom is nevertheless radical and authentic, that we are, really and truly, free. How? That is the matter of this post.
I find the admission that freedom is uncreated rather interesting here. It signifies a recognition that if freedom is entirely God-created, then freedom is not really free. I reject the assumption that we are thoroughly caused. The existence of everlasting beings is what Krista would refer to as a brute fact. In other words, there is no underlying explanation past theot level. Some might argue that God is also a brute fact in this sense, but most Christians address this by claiming that God is a necessary being that can be explained. In any case, the principle of sufficient reason does not really apply to what I assume. Our freedom is radical and authentic because it is an innate aspect of our everlasting beingness.
The basic problem is how to square our freedom with the fact that we must be exhaustively caused in order to be just what we are in and in virtue of any of our acts, and so as to be each an instance of order, reason, intelligibility, and cosmic coordination, rather than chaos, madness, unbeing.
To me, this amounts to trying to fit a square peg into a round hole.
If our acts are exhaustively caused by their priors, then may they be exhaustively reasonable. But also in that case are they by their priors exhaustively determined, so that they follow inexorably and immutably from those priors. In that case they are not really free, and so, are not acts in the first place. Which, if true, would mean that we are not ourselves actual, but rather a mere mechanical sequelae of prior equally mechanical events.
An expansion of the square peg round hole dilemma.
If on the other hand, our acts are not exhaustively caused by our priors, then to the extent they are not, they are free, but are they not in that case, and to the extent that they are undetermined by their priors, simply random? Are they not then each at least in part a violation of the PSR? And would not that insufficiency of their reasonableness introduce a bit of chaos to every act by every agent of the world, thereby rendering the world itself chaotic, radically disordered? Yes.
Again, the PSR does not really apply in the assumptions that I propose. However, the PSR is vital if one assumes classical theism to be true. Concerning the matter of agents introducing a bit of chaos to every act by every agent in the world, I would say there is truth in this, though I would not say every act by every agent. Some acts introduce order. Some acts introduce love, some creativity, and so forth. Such positive acts, acts aligned with creation through love, and the acts of God, who also works in creation, keep creation from spinning into a radically disordered chaos. However, there is no guarantee that creation cannot spin into a radically disordered chaos at some point in the future. I see creation as the dynamic interaction between order/disorder, love/the rejection of love, loving creation/hating creation, life/death. Since each being in creation works from its own innate freedom, it has the power to introduce all sorts of things into creation. Since God has limited control over this freedom, whatever the uncreated freedom of beings introduces into creation profoundly affects the overarching movement and flux of creation.
Our acts are indeed underspecified by their causal priors. On Godelian incompleteness, this must logically be so. On Gödel, the specification string of each of our acts is infinite, whereas the set of its causal factors, all antecedent acts of creatures, and the act of God, is finite. The proscenium and forecondition of each creaturely act consists of the entire set of beings to it extant as facts. Of such sets, God is the only member of all of them. But each such set is finite, even though it contains an infinite member, God. The finite set of causal factors of each of our acts is not sufficient to specify the infinite formal specification of exactly what its character shall be.
This is where we begin to veer into concepts like infinity, which classical theists use to separate God from creation in categorical terms. Classical theists also use infinity to confuse and derail. Are we talking about potential infinities or actual infinities? Countable or uncountable? Anyone in the mood for a Zeno's paradox? How about traversing the infinite? I don't much care for that sort of thing. I think one's metaphysical assumptions can be stated in simpler, more readily comprehensible terms. Anyway, in reference to Gödelian incompleteness, I assume that the idea referred to has something to do with no single formal system being able to capture all mathematical truths. The reference appears to be setting up some sort of argument in which God, as a formal system, cannot capture all of creation's truths, or, put more clearly, that some acts slip outside the boundaries of the formal system that is God. Hence, he cannot determine those acts.
So, some portion of the formal specification of each creaturely act is at its inception not yet specified. This is a way of saying that at the inception of each of our acts, we have options among which we must choose. This is why actual beings must be free.
Ah, there it is. God is a formal system, but even he cannot consistently and completely axiomatize creation, because if he did, we would not really be free. Sure, but doesn't this fly in the face of God's omnipowers? Doesn't that little bit of space open up enough room for the chaotic disorder that freedom threatens to introduce into the cosmos, thereby upsetting the order and reason?
The underspecification of our acts ex ante means that actual beings must be to some extent causa sui. The completion of our specification cannot be determined by God. It must be determined by us on the fly, in the midst of each new occasion of life.
Causa sui means self-caused. Ex ante means based on forecasts rather than results. I assume actual beings here refers to the Aristotelian distinction between potentiality and actuality, implying that beings referred to represent a complete, primary state of being. In my own case, I assume all beings are originally causa sui in a sense that they have always existed in some way or other. The forms beings assume in creation are not primary states of being, but other states of being.
This description of our ontic predicament has in its favor the fact that it pretty much nails what it is like to be us from one moment to the next. We make it up as we go, doing our best, given what we know and understand, and always at least a little unsure of whether we are doing quite the right thing with all, indeed, often fairly sure we are erring quite badly.
I pretty much agree with the description of how some beings deal with their freedom in creation, but I don't accept the ontic predicament that is outlined.
Because our completion of each act cannot be determined by God, he cannot be properly said to create it. Rather, he creates the conditions for its coming to be, he creates the conditions for free acts. Our being is one of those conditions.
Our being is our being, not God's being. God does not create conditions for anything coming to be in the original sense. Within creation, he creates conditions for free acts and other things, sure, but the free acts do not depend on those conditions alone. If they did, they would be reduced to necessity. The conditions referred to are also created by the other agents in creation, all exercising their inherent freedom. The emphasis on acts alone also simplifies what I believe the essence of freedom to be. Freedom is far more than just acting upon or reacting to conditions. Freedom also co-creates conditions.
God creates us, but he does not create our acts. It is in this sense, then, that our freedom is uncreated. That God and all our other antecedents do not altogether determine our acts is to say that they are really free.
God created our current forms in creation, but he did not create us as beings. Nor did he create the freedom that is innate within us as beings. It is in that sense that freedom is uncreated.
There is more. The forms of the options open to us by the underspecification of our acts by their causal factors are present to us as implicit in those factors. Such options are logically implicit in their array. To say that the forms of our options are logically implicit in the array of the causal factors of our acts is just to say that they are present and accessible to us in the logos. They are implicit in the creaturely causal factors of our acts only in virtue of their a priori and eternal implication in the logos. Then the possibilities that we might do this or that, given our antecedents, our options at each new moment of action, are eternal.
The square peg reappears.
Thus, while the ultimate source of all the resources of our free acts, including the effective characters of all the underdetermined options open to us, is God, nevertheless, we ourselves are the sources of the final bits of our own specifications that are not given in and by our causal factors. Of those final bits of ourselves that are not specified by our causal factors, we are the originators. We are to that extent causa sui, we are to that extent uncreated, we are to that extent free, and so our freedom, our capacity to cause ourselves, is uncreated. It is an essential aspect of our actuality.
This seems to be saying that God is the source and cause of everything, but we are somehow originators in a tiny little way because we get to choose among the various causes God makes available to us or imposes upon us. I get a vision of a lab rat in an ever-shifting maze. He doesn't have any input on how or why the walls of the maze shift, his only input is choosing from the openings made available to him. In this sense, the scientist managing the maze has no real control over which route the rat will take. Thus, the rat is free. I guess my approach is more existentialist at heart. I don't think true or complete actuality or reality resides in the measurable, external, physical world. True actuality also involves spiritual, subjective experience, grounded in uncreated freedom that transcends choice and options amidst shifting maze walls. Uncreated freedom signifies a state of potential, a state of creative becoming spiritually, which I regard as far more actual than conventional definitions of actuality.
It should however be noted also that in the final analysis, all the properties of a given creature are in themselves, like freedom, uncreate, for they are forms, which are all eternal, which are ideas in the mind of God. Creatures are created, but their properties are not. My bipedality, for example, is not novel with me. Rather, bipedality is eternal, and so is uncreate, and as one of its concrete instantiations, I partake it. So likewise with freedom.
Beings as concrete actualizations of forms, God's eternal, unchanging ideas, is another spin on uncreated creations. Unlike my assumption, which posits that existing beings were created into other forms, Krista assumes we are creatures who are made up of uncreated properties, all of which are eternal and belong to God. Our actuality implies that we are concrete instantiations of uncreated properties in the form of forms, hence, uncreated creations. At least, that's what seems to be implied. That strikes me as quite interesting. Both of us appear to acknowledge the need for uncreated creations for freedom to be free. My uncreated part comprises pre-existing beings, while Krista assumes these uncreated parts must emanate from God. I don't know how freedom can be equated with other properties like having 2 feet, but I think it draws attention to how radically different my assumptions of freedom are from what is posited above. Properties like bipedality do not strike me as eternal, unchanging forms. In fact, the whole notion of unchanging, eternal forms strikes me as anathema. I assume beings are uncreated out with creation and created within creation, albeit while retaining some uncreated attributes like freedom. Things like bipedality belong in the created category, as far as I'm concerned. Freedom does not. I don't regard freedom as some eternal idea of God's that we participate in. It is a fundamental reality like our being. Uncreated being and freedom together are fundamental. We bring both into creation with us without the help of God.
To the extent that we are uncreated, we are images of God. There are other ways we are as images. For example, the specification string of each finite occasion is infinite. Our uncreated bits are participations in His own free act. However, we differ from God in that, unlike Him, we cannot be ourselves alone, or even in combination with any number of other creatures, the sufficient forecondition of any other being. Like God, we influence other beings by the characters of our own acts. We do this by simply being who we are, and what we are.
I have a different assumption of what we are. Anyway, Krista states that it is only through forms that we are images of God, at least that is what seems to be implied, and it is through these uncreated bits that we are participants in His own free act. If I'm interpreting that correctly, that seems to suggest that participation in freedom is anchored in forms, in God's eternal idea of freedom. That seems like a gross abstraction to me, one that keeps freedom firmly within God's control, except for some minute part in which we get to choose from prearranged and likely predetermined options. We are being. Even without God, we are being. God did not provide us with being.
God does that too. But, unlike us, He is alone sufficient as the ontological forecondition of other beings. He is, after all, the way that beings can influence each other. He is the way that beings get their original and basic being. As the logic of being is such, he is the way that being is. So, it is proper to say of him, but not of us, that he brings other beings into being. We influence their characters, he enables that influence by creating us, and them. Thus, while our acts are, like his, truly creative, the difference is that our acts create only ourselves, whereas his act creates all things.
I assume that the original and basic beingness of beings existed without God. In this sense, we don't get our original and basic being from God. I don't assume God brings other beings into being. I assume God brings beings into creation. God certainly creates, but he does not create all things in the sense of creating them from himself or from nothing. He certainly did not create freedom or agency.
The causal priors of an occasion suffice as reasons for its inception, but not for its final character. The inception of an occasion begins a process of aesthetic selection, the criteria thereof being given in the nature of its initiation, but the specification string of that nature is not a complete and exhaustive specification of its final character. Rather, the initial aim specifies the goodness, beauty, complexity, and so forth, which each novel creaturely occasion must take as guides in its search for a proper solution of its ontic predicament. That search, the specification of satisfactory solutions, and the data, together, the dimensions of the solution space, are given with the initial aim, but the search itself is stochastic, and thus its conclusion cannot be specified beforehand.
This seems like hedging omniscience and the whole causal chain to allow for some semblance of freedom. In my mind, the strict and unforgiving chain of cause and effect acts as an alienating force on freedom and true spirituality. I assume that true spiritual freedom transcends causality. The freedom Christ posits is of the free will variety, the kind God grants to force, yes, force, humans into choosing between following God's law or sinning. For me, free will represents a very limited conception of freedom. But IF went as far as to declare it a fatal form of freedom. He even went as far as to say that he regarded the free will doctrine to be an enslaving force. I can't say I disagree with that.
Thanks to the constraints of the solution space given in its initial aim to each novel occasion, its stochastic search for a solution is not disordered or without sufficient reason. This is so even of searches that end in errant solutions, that miss the mark, that are sinful. Sinful options are among those open to us at every turn. If we knew perfectly, we would know perfectly how each action possible to us at each moment would turn out, and how it would feel to suffer it. But we are partition and finite, and can't know anything perfectly. This too is a corollary of Godelian incompleteness. So we can err about the best thing to do right now, and choose a lesser good over a greater.
This raises the whole question of why an omni-God who creates all the conditions for us to exercise our uncreated based on an eternal form freedom, would allow sinful options or choices that missed the mark in the first place. Why couldn't he create us to be free of having to make such choices? Free from evil altogether. I won't go into that now, other than to say that it is not God alone who creates the conditions for us to exercise our freedom.
I think that does it. We are underdetermined by our causal priors, and therefore a bit free, a bit causa sui. Our freedom as such, like our other properties, including the property of being, is eternal, and so our freedom is not created. Rather, in our freedom we partake the freedom of God. But that we are underdetermined does not mean that our freedom is chaotic. It is thoroughly ordered by the aesthetic preference given to us at the inception of each moment of our stochastic process of becoming, as the essential character and valence of its yearning and striving.
So, in a nutshell, what seems to be proposed is that freedom is uncreated because it is an eternal form in the mind of God. We partake in that freedom of God, and it is through this partaking of an eternal, unchanging, form that our freedom is uncreated even though we are thoroughly created, right down to our original being, and why we are a bit causa sui and a bit free even though we are otherwise thoroughly caused and unfree. I suppose that's the best that can be done with uncreated freedom when one holds the core metaphysical tenets of classical theism to be true. However, A bit free and a bit causa sui. Free will based on the uncreated ideas of God is not the kind of uncreated freedom I assume. A bit causa sui and a bit free seems to me like a hedge. It's a definition of kind of but not really free freedom that subtly attempts to acknowledge the fundamental need for uncreated freedom but cannot let go of God as absolute, which, for me, is the very thing that makes uncreated freedom impossible and a contradiction in terms. Note added, though I don't agree with Krista's assessment of how and why freedom is uncreated, I do applaud him for recognizing that the essence of freedom must be uncreated to be authentically free. The medical school analogy for mortal life lived for salvation and theosis, something more is needed. Bruce Charlton. I have previously made an analogy between our situation in this mortal life in relation to heaven, and that of a student at medical school training to be a doctor. Mortal life equals medical school, heaven equals being a doctor. I have found this analogy helpful in trying to articulate the difference to this mortal life made by the expectation of heaven. When mortal life is lived primarily to achieve salvation. To live this mortal life as much as possible with the sole aim of working towards salvation into heaven, is actually the highest aspiration of many Christian denominations. This corresponds to attending medical school with the sole aim of passing the exams and qualifying as a doctor. Some students approximate to this idea, their horizon is bounded by the goal of attaining a pass grade in final exams. They work hard attending official classes, revising material over and again, practicing exam techniques. All focused on reaching the minimum standard. They strive to master the exam curriculum but nothing more, because that would be a misdirection of effort away from the essential aim. The aim is to pass the exams safely, rather than well. But if such people can safely and without sanctions attain the aimed at medical qualification without working or exams, for example by bribery, they will do so. All they want is that degree certificate. Medical school is nothing but a way of qualifying as a doctor. This suggests how and why salvation is a fundamentally insufficient basis for life. When medical school is nothing but a means to an end, then it has no value of itself. Likewise, if salvation is all that matters, then this mortal life is devalued, and, like achieving a qualification by bribery, it would be better if it could be dispensed with. The salvation-focused Christian will often yearn to have this mortal life over and done, or that it never had been. He thinks, if only God had created reality such that I had been incarnated directing into heaven, instead of being compelled to endure this mortal rigmarole, how much better things would have been. At the end of this perspective lurks the suspicion that God messed up, or maybe exhibits traits of ruthless cruelty, in compelling us to endure the futile miseries of mortal life. In sum, a mortal life lived wholly to attain salvation would, even if successful, be a meaningless life. When the aim of mortal life is theosis, as well as salvation. By theosis, which I regard as being broadly the same as concepts such as sanctification, exaltation, deification, I mean the idea that a purpose of this mortal life is to fit us for heaven. The idea that we should, through our lives, strive to make ourselves more holy, more divine in character, more like Jesus Christ, purer, less sinful and more virtuous, more fully orientated to the life of heaven. In the analogy, this corresponds to the student whose goal at medical school looks beyond the examinations and the degree certificate, and who strives to prepare himself for working as a doctor. Such a student would seek out extra, and more specialized, teaching, might attend research seminars as well as didactic lectures, would perhaps visit other medical schools and explore other models of medical services. He might go beyond just picking the brains of his medical teachers for essential facts and useful exam tips, and try to understand what makes doctors tick, engaging in deeper conversations about the whys, as well as the hows. Theosis therefore entails orientating beyond salvation, and has potential to add considerably to the function of mortal life, somewhat as orientating beyond qualification adds to the interest and enjoyment of being a medical student. Yet, even a mortal life that combines theosis with salvation is deficient, because it accords no value to the actual here and now mortal life. Even with theosis, mortal life is still nothing more a means to an end. Although the end is enlarged by theosis, this actual present life is still utterly subordinated to the necessity and needs of post-mortal life. The intrinsic value of mortal life. For mortal life to be valid in itself requires that mortal life have intrinsic value, and is not merely a means to an end, no matter how glorious and eternal that end. In the analogy, this imperative corresponds to the value to the potential extracurricular activities at medical school of a student who is already committed to salvation and theosis. Those many other possible ways that make the life of the student richer, more social, more creative. Participating in sports, music, societies. Reading widely in literature. Making strong friendship. Romantic relationships. Self-discovery and development. Thinking about life, and understanding the essentials as deeply as possible. Choosing an aim, a path, a quest. These extracurricular, non-medical, activities of an imaged student, recognize that he is not just a student, they are rooted in a recognition that he is, or rather I am, from the point of view of the student, a here and now human being with all the requirements of such. This is analogous to the necessity that these our mortal lives be valued for themselves. That this mortal life is not only for something, it is of value intrinsically. In other words, we are not supposed to live only in conformity to external demands, we are not supposed to live only to qualify for heaven and serve its purposes, because we have our own unique nature and potentials that demand to be gratified, and ought to be gratified. Of course, our spontaneous nature and potentials, just considered in and of themselves, and without salvation and theosis, might well include much that would be selfish or destructive, evil. This would correspond to the old, mostly upper-class, medical students who would attend college but do as little as possible towards qualifying or equipping themselves for medical practice. They would do as little as possible except, for example, playing sports, socializing, wenching, hunting, boozing, and lazing. To be an ideal medical student, there must be as a basis the genuine motivation both to qualify as a doctor, and also to look beyond qualification to aim at being a good doctor. This is the essential framework. This is why I emphasize the necessity of a framework for mortal life, corresponding to salvation and theosis. However, we ought to recognize that, although necessary, salvation and theosis are not sufficient. Something more is also needed, is indeed essential, and that something has to do with that which is unique to each of us. World gone wrong. William Wildblood. A good indication that this is a fallen world is the existence of insects that feed on human and animal blood. I would speculate that when God created the various forms of life, it was a law that each group maintained itself by feeding on lower forms. Thus, plants absorb nutrients from the soil in which they grow, animals consume vegetable matter, and humans can eat both meat and plants. I have left out carnivorous animals here, but that is, as it were, a horizontal process. And it too may be the result of the fall. Possibly there were no carnivores in the pre-lapsarian world, or, if there were, they ate less evolved forms of animal life. Be that as it may, blood-sucking insects are something else. We instinctively feel the wrongness of such a thing, and not just because they irritate us and spread disease. We recognize there is something unholy and corrupt about a lower form of life feeding on a higher form. One might even put certain bacteria and viruses into this category of life forms not created by God but instead being the product of the deforming of life by the dark forces and or wrong human thought which has its effect in the external world, particularly in the deep past when physical matter was not as dense as it is now. Obviously, the materialist will write this idea off as complete nonsense, but it is a plausible theory from the spiritual perspective. God did not create mosquitoes and similar unpleasant creatures. They are either the creation of the created, a physical instantiation of spiritual misalignment, or diabolical perversions like the orcs Morgoth made from elves in Tolkien's world. For the sake of this post I looked up when blood-sucking insects are first thought to have evolved, and the answer is about 150 million years ago, which would seem to put paid to the idea. But life on this planet has been around for a lot longer than we currently estimate, as the earlier forms existed when the Earth was less material than it is now, so have left no trace. When God created the world he pronounced it good, but it has gone bad, and one of the signs of that is the existence of lower forms of life feeding on higher. In Siberia there are myths that say the mosquito arose from the ashes or fragments of some giant creature or demon. Similar tales are found in North American myth, with the mosquito arising from the ashes of a man-eater, suggesting a common origin. It is accepted by many people that myths do point to genuine realities, so perhaps here we have a folk memory of the fact that not all life forms were created by God/the gods, but some are corruptions in a world gone wrong. It is through freedom that we discern the nature of God. Francis Berger. The matter of freedom is important to me because it is through freedom that we discern the nature of God. It is through freedom that we apprehend God either as a loving Father or as an absolute, autocratic ruler or a completed, static entity. What we assume about freedom determines what we assume about God. Traditional Christianity posits that nothing can be prior to or outside of God. If nothing can be prior to or outside of God, then, as stated in Acts 17:28, in God, we live and move and have our being. The same applies to everything in existence, and it only follows that it should apply to freedom. The problem is that it can't, at least not if God is perfect, eternal, ultimate, timeless, and omni-everything, all of which traditional Christianity insists upon. Thus, freedom is defined as an innate attribute of actual creatures, as an extension of God's freedom in which all actual creatures participate, albeit minutely, or as an uncreated eternal idea in the mind of God, imbued in all creatures that can then utilize the eternal idea to align themselves with God's law via free will choices. Whatever the explanation, the ultimate source of freedom is God, which contradicts what freedom is. Traditional Christianity has not regarded this as a problem, because it emphasizes the omni-attributes, divine sovereignty, and ultimacy of God above considerations of freedom, relegating them to afterthought. If all freedom is contingent upon God, and traditional Christianity insists that it must be because God is ultimately the source of everything, then it is not free in any authentic sense, conceptually, existentially, or otherwise. Factoring in God's omni-attributes like omnipotence and omniscience only deepens the contradictions implicit in traditional/classical theological explanations and qualifications. Arguing that God creates actual beings and that these beings are free solves nothing when one considers the sort of freedom that is implied within such a framework. Because God created everything, He also creates the conditions for our free acts. The freedom that free actual creatures partake in is then reduced to choosing from the options within the conditions God created and organized. Many Christians argue that although God creates the conditions for our choices, He cannot and does not force our choices. Moreover, despite His omniscience, He does not and cannot know what we choose. Hence, we are free. If we are good, God-aligned Christians, we will be able to discern the right option or options within those conditions God has predetermined for us. If we cannot discern the right choice or, worse, purposely make the wrong choice, we are the hook for sin and, potentially, damnation. What is outlined above is known as the free will doctrine, and for most Christians it sets the tone and boundaries of what freedom is and what it involves. This capability to choose between good and evil within a set of conditions God has organized is often presented as one of the great gifts God has bestowed upon humanity because it grants people the freedom to accept or reject God, creation, and the good in favor of embracing Satan, captivity, and evil. Defenders of the free will doctrine point to humanity's unconstrained and voluntary ability to choose between good and evil as proof of God's infinite love via His refusal to coerce or force. The problem with the doctrine of free will is simple: it is not about freedom at all. To begin with, if God grants man free will, then whatever freedom resides within it emanates from God, not man. It makes no difference at all if the source of that freedom comes from some eternal form in God's mind, the source is still God. After all, it's His idea. The freedom is created freedom, which is not really freedom. Secondly, God determines the scope and range of choice to which free will may be applied. On the one side is the good choice to abide by God's law and commands. On the other side is rejecting this law and embracing evil. Thus, the free will choice essentially boils down to obeying God's law and commands. Or else. The free will doctrine makes man accountable for his choices between good and evil within the context of God's laws and commands. It places the onus of such choices on man while simultaneously exempting God from all accountability. The doctrine of free will provides man the freedom to be the offender while simultaneously relieving God of all responsibility for evil choices. Man's free will choice to be a transgressor of divine law also justifies God's role as a punisher of divine law transgressions. In simplest terms, the free will doctrine is God adopting a my way or the highway framework of freedom. Use the free will I provided to do what I command, and all will be well. Use the free will I provided to reject my commands, and all will be lost. Seen this way, the free will choice to obey God's law and command becomes a matter of necessity. Man needs to choose the good option God has provided or else face the consequences. But what if no good option is available? More on that later. The need to choose the good, this necessity inherent within the free will choice, does not emanate from within man but is externally imposed by God. As such, it does little more than ask a man to adhere to or fulfill a given law or command, leaving no space for creativity or a creative act. The free will doctrine reduces man to a mere instrument in the fulfillment of God's law. It lacks all spiritual dynamism, and ultimately relegates freedom to the level of submission. Then there is also the matter of the available options in the conditions God organizes to engender our free choices. Where exactly do the bad options come from? If God creates the conditions for our free will choices, then He must also, in some way, be responsible for creating conditions that allow for evil choices or, at the very least, conditions in which no good choice seems possible. The trolley problem is a good example of conditions in which no apparent good option exists. Pull the switch, and a person tied to one set of tracks dies. Push the switch, and 3 people tied to another set of tracks die. What is the good option? Although the trolley problem is a hypothetical thought experiment, it sheds light on something everyone has experienced at some point in their lives, conditions in which God's law and the possibility of a good choice are absent. Yes, there are 1,000 arguments and doctrines about how there is good in that somewhere, or we are too blind or fallen to see the right choice, or the bad choice is non-being/not really of God, or God cannot create conditions for bad choices because a bachelor cannot be married. However, if God does create the conditions for our free choices, and most Christians insist that He does create those conditions and that we simply complete the equation through our choices, then it seems that at least some of those conditions are set up in such a way as to make choices for evil virtually unavoidable. Again, what we assume about freedom determines what we assume about God. Ungrund or primordial chaos. Francis Berger. Although I do not agree with everything Badiaf assumes, I admire him for understanding that freedom could only be truly free if it were placed outside of God, which he accomplished by arguing for the existence of the Ungrund, a reworking of Boomer's primordial abyss that Badiaf defines as pure meonic freedom, a formless chaos of potential that existed before God and from which God emerges through a self-caused act of will and becomes being. Unlike traditional Christians, Badiaf claims that God then created from the Ungrund rather than ex nihilo. Thus, all beings in creation share the same uncreated freedom that God possesses. That uncreated, meonic freedom inherent in all created beings contains the capacity for both good and evil. Although God was able to master this freedom for good only, the beings He creates fall short. Hence, the existence of free choice for evil in creation. Although I respect Badiaf for recognizing that freedom must be outside of God for it to be authentic, I am inclined to think his insistence on placing the reality of freedom before being posits an unlikely state. Can freedom or the potential for freedom even exist outside of being? If it can, then it is pure potential, which is exactly what Badiaf argues. But what is potential if it does not exist within something to potentiate? For me, it seems simpler and more comprehensible to envision freedom existing within beings, more precisely, within beings that have no beginning and no end. With this in mind, I see Badiaf's Ungrund more as a primordial, pre-creation chaos containing eternal, not timeless but having no beginning and no end, spiritual beings who innately possess freedom. Instead of emerging from an Ungrund of meonic freedom, God emerges from a primordial chaos of eternal beings through a self-caused act of freedom and creativity. God then shapes and forms the eternal beings of the primordial chaos into creation. Problems defining and describing time or timelessness. Francis Berger. Eternal is a difficult, ambiguous word. In the past, I used it to describe beings, which I assume have no beginning and no end. Unfortunately, this led some to believe that such beings must also exist entirely outside time. Or that they never change. However, I regard time as a necessary aspect of beings and cannot imagine any being existing outside time. Which means I assume all beings change. Yeah, but how can beings that have no beginning and no end be in time? Where does that time start? What kind of time is it? More on that in another post, perhaps. Back to eternal. I do my best to work around it to avoid confusion about timelessness. But what else is there? Unfortunately, other words are rarely helpful. Everlasting. Misunderstandable. Never-ending. Also implies a beginning. Forever. Okay, but from when? Perpetual. Primordial. Of course, my problem is not novel. It has affected and continues to affect others. For example, for some thinkers eternal means both timeless and temporal, as in the assumption that God is timeless without creation and temporal after he created time. Others describe God as everlasting but temporal, and use it to mean that God never began to exist and will never go out of existence, but experiences temporal succession. That kind of lines up with what I assume, but whenever I use the word everlasting, it is misinterpreted as having a beginning but no end. Eternal is not a straightforward word. Unfortunately, most of the other words aren't much better. We need to coin some new words, tout de suite. Note, tout de suite is French for immediately, just in case Dr. Charlton reads this. Uncreated means not divinely created and not divine in origin. Francis Berger. I posit that freedom must be uncreated to be authentic. Uncreated signifies not divine in origin, meaning it does not emanate from God. Since God is not the source of freedom, he cannot create freedom into us or any other being in creation. Declaring freedom to be a timeless and uncreated form, which is an eternal idea in the mind of God, and then stating that our participation in this uncreated form qualifies as uncreated seems like a bit of a stretch to me. The distinction here is clear. God creates creatures, but their properties, all of their properties, are uncreated because all properties, including physical features like noses, are eternal forms in the mind of God. The concept is known as divine exemplarism, which focuses on the metaphysics of universals. It asserts that everything in creation originates from divine, eternal forms in God's mind. Thus, our freedom is based on an uncreated blueprint called freedom that God holds as an eternal idea. First point, this does not make freedom uncreated in the way I understand it. Freedom as an eternal form in God's mind still makes God the source of freedom. It matters little that this form in God's mind is uncreated in the same way God is uncreated. He remains the origin of freedom by creating our capacity to be free agents. Hence, freedom as an eternal form may be uncreated in the sense that God didn't create it, but the idea is still God's, meaning he is ultimately the source of that uncreated idea. Second point, a blueprint is only good if it leads to creation. An eternal property or form or universal or whatever in God's mind may be eternal and uncreated, but what he constructs from these divine blueprints is definitely created, otherwise, there would be nothing we could call creation. There may be an uncreated blueprint in the mind of God for a nose, but my actual nose, the tip of which I see every day when I stare out upon the world, is created. It may be based on an uncreated eternal idea or blueprint, but it is not uncreated and eternal. The same applies to freedom. The freedom I experience may be based on an eternal, uncreated idea in the mind of God, but once God creates my freedom, that freedom becomes created, even if it is based on something uncreated. If freedom is an eternal idea in God's mind, then God is the source of freedom. An eternal idea or form may be uncreated, but once God creates from it, the thing he creates is a created thing. The properties may not be created, but the thing the properties comprise is certainly created. Freedom as an eternal, universal form may be uncreated, but the specific, individual capacity for freedom or to participate in freedom that God creates into a creature cannot be anything but created. In classical/orthodox metaphysics, only God, including his essence, ideas, etc. is uncreated. Everything else is contingent and created, including the freedom creatures experience. In classical/orthodox metaphysics, the existence of freedom, and everything else for that matter, depends entirely on God. Without God, I would have no freedom of my own of which to speak. The only freedom I can enjoy is the freedom God grants me, allows me to participate in, or creates into me. None of that has anything to do with uncreated freedom, at least not as I regard it. The Spiritual Crisis of Modern Man Redux. William Wildblood. In a couple of months my new book A Survival Guide to the End Times will be published, and I am reminded that I should promote and publicize it. For someone like me, that's the least pleasant part of bringing a book to life, but obviously I understand the need for it. However, for now there's an earlier book I would like to draw attention to because it isn't included in the sidebar on the right. That's because it's a collection of posts from this blog, so I published it myself through Amazon rather than submit it to a proper publisher. The title is the title of this post, and that describes what the book is about. We are in a crisis. I would say almost everyone recognizes this, but by no means everyone recognizes the cause of the crisis. It is our rejection of transcendence, which is a fancy way of saying rejection of the spiritual. So, it is a spiritual crisis, and that affects everything else because everything, absolutely everything, is downstream from the spiritual. If the source is poisoned, then the water will be too. And we have poisoned the source. The essays of this book are ranged under various broad headings such as God, truth, Christ, love, morality, evil, the spiritual path and spiritual practice, and modern times. Then there are subjects like Buddhism, non-duality, masculine and feminine, and the masters, which interest me but are narrower in scope. The message behind all of them, though, is that we are in a crisis of monumental proportions. There's no point in beating about the bush. One has to recognize this if one is to address it properly. That it is not acknowledged is why it is worsening, which is the case. As a matter of fact, this ties in with the new book. The Spiritual Crisis is an end times scenario. It is a product of the withdrawal of spirit and consequent dominance of matter, which is what occurs when a cycle comes to an end and the initial injection of spiritual energy has dissipated to the point at which we are basically running on fumes. At the same time, this represents opportunity because although the end times affects everything we experience, we still have the divine spark within us, and the outer degradation can force us to rediscover this. When your world is collapsing, you turn to eternal truth which can never be affected by phenomenal decay. That is what we must do to surmount the present crisis. Resurrection, not incarnation, is the most shocking and strange thing about Christianity. Bruce Charlton. I have often heard it emphasized by Christians how remarkable, how shocking, it was that God was incarnated as a little baby, lived, suffered and died an ignominious and agonizing death. But is it really so shocking? All of these are familiar possibilities for a being that is an avatar of a god, a spirit part of God that takes on human form and lives as a human, perhaps a superpowered human, maybe even breeds with humans, etc. Jesus is not an avatar, but my point is that the general idea of a god taking on a human form is common enough. Neither is it all that shocking when the incarnated God comes back to life after being killed, since all societies seem to have believed in some kind of continuation of existence after biological death, so nothing really dies altogether, posited some kind of afterlife, and gods in particular would be expected to be unkillable. What is really shocking is that when the divine Jesus came back to life, it was not as a spirit. Instead, God became a man again, in a man's body, and for eternity. Jesus was resurrected. I think that this is so shocking that, as far as I can tell, most Christians still don't believe it, and have never really believed it, but instead have always tried to claim that Jesus' resurrected body was not really what it seemed, but some kind of embodied spirit. It is, apparently, very difficult for people to accept that a creator God could have a body like ours, eternally, and still be God. To most intellectual Christians, at any rate, it seems intrinsically ridiculous that something solid and bounded might be superior to something unbounded of pure spirit, so they resort to various types of yes, but argument, that explain resurrection as retaining the appearance of an incarnate body while replacing its inner reality with spirit. If this was so, the question is why? Why did Jesus bother with resurrection, if the body was merely a kind of illusion? Why didn't he make eternal life explicitly a thing of pure spirit? Why go to all the trouble of making it look like Jesus had an absolutely humanish body? Why the emphasis on how normal his body seemed? An emphasis, but not exclusive. After all, Jesus was hard to recognize, could apparently appear and disappear, etc. But certainly the primary point being made is that this was in some essential way the same human body that Jesus had inhabited before he died, with the same appearance, wounds, etc., and it was certainly solid to touch, and he ate food. If we take the fourth gospel as primary, and the other gospels as partial confirmations, it is evident that the resurrection was into a normal, solid, material human body, and that was the main thing about it. We should not allow secondary explanations to remove that major, and shocking, fact. The distinctive thing about Christianity is therefore not eternal life in heaven, but eternal life in some version of our actual solid human body. There must be something very important about the body, if it is to become eternal for us, in heaven. Note, on further reflection, the fact of resurrection has very wide-ranging implications for the nature of ultimate reality, including the nature of life in heaven. In a nutshell, resurrection implies that the life eternal promised by Jesus to those who follow him is a resurrected life, a life certainly including resurrected entities, beings, things from this mortal life. Not, therefore, a life of pure spirit or thought, but a life of everlasting solid beings and objects of many kinds, thought consisting of / interacting with solid things. Perhaps C.S. Lewis intuited this, in his fantasy of the Great Divorce. Further note added today, this is an edited repost of what strikes me as a significant insight, i.e. significant for me, which made near zero impact at the time of first publication 7 years ago, except on William Tykanevich, and indeed, I did not properly grasp it myself. So here 'tis again. Is the planet of Kolob, i.e. the Mormon Heaven planet, in principle discoverable in outer space? Bruce Charlton. Reading Lyth's latest aphorisms, he reminded me of a 2019 post from William James Tykanevich about whether or not the Mormon prophet Joseph Smith was, in principle, correct to posit an actual planet, assumed to be orbiting a star that Mormons term Kolob, as the place of God's usual residence, thus the physical, material location of heaven. I made a comment at W.M. Jas at the time, and find I have further notions now that I have thought further about heaven in relation to entropy, creation, and love. I mean that I now understand resurrected, i.e. incarnate, physical, material, eternal life to be possible in a situation where all the beings have committed eternally to be wholly motivated by love. It is this living from love that abolishes entropy. To express it as a double negative, or, differently expressed, enables all of resurrected creation to be eternal, eternally developing, eternally living. Heaven happened when this became possible, during Jesus' ministry, I assume, and began to be populated when humans, and other beings, made the choice and eternal commitment to love, and began to be resurrected. Thinking about the possibility of something like the planet of Kolob, and whether it would be discoverable as a place in this universe, somewhere that might theoretically be travelable to, I realized that it seems relevant that resurrected human beings are, apparently, to be able to visit and function on this earth, and in mortal affairs. For example, some of the beings people call angels are resurrected humans. This would mean that eternal human beings can exist on Earth, and in an environment where nearly everything else, or, indeed everything else, is mortal and subject to entropy, decay, death. And it seems that angels are not usually recognized as such, and indeed, at least in the modern West, angels are regarded as impossible nonsense. My notion is that even if mortal human beings were capable of traveling to a heaven such as the planet of Kolob is supposed to be, and even if these people were allowed to enter into this heaven, for example to investigate and study Kolob, then it is quite possible that these mortal human beings would not recognize or realize that they were in the place of heaven. It is, indeed, easy to imagine that modern Western men would even deny vehemently that heaven was heaven if told the fact, even if these people actually were living in heaven, i.e. were present as mortal incarnates in the situation of heaven, but were not resurrected incarnates. This self-blinding to heaven is, after all, no different from our mainstream and official on-principle / by assumption / and absolute denial of even the possibility of paranormal, supernatural, spiritual, and or divine phenomena. As Tolkien showed in literary form, evil cannot comprehend good, likewise those who reject and are unfit for heaven, cannot even perceive heaven. Note, I should be clear that Kolob does not play an active role in my own theological metaphysics, indeed I have not even considered the matter for some years. But I don't see why heaven, or God the Father's dwelling place, should be one particular planet, or the reason I write here is that those who reflexively reject the idea as absurd, insane, or stupid, could probably benefit from thinking more deeply about their reasons for doing so. Yeah, that'll work. Continuous progressive societal and self-improvement, by changing names. Bruce Charlton. It's a great plan. Let's spend ever more and yet more time / energy / resources on locating the sins of other people, and then loudly and emphatically stating that these other people were sinful. It will make us all better people, and make this a better world, for sure. Especially when these people lived generations ago, and someplace else. Let's do loads of research to discover more and novel examples of individuals or groups of sinners. And then let's write books, make TV programs and movies about how they were sinful, very sinful, and then splash these across the media in a kind of saturation process. Let's change the names of everything named for other people who were sinners, especially from the olden days, while explaining over and again that doing this makes us better people. But refusing to change names means, on the contrary, that we personally approve of all the sins of all the other people who ever lived. Because people who don't want to change names of sinners, actually personally desire that everybody nowadays ought to be doing these sins, all the time. Bad kitty. We can be confident that by changing more and more names, we shall incrementally, a little bit at a time admittedly, but cumulatively, improve ourselves and human society. If only we could sustain and expand such a strategy of world reform for decade after decade, i.e. for an additional 40+ years, it would be certain to reduce, maybe abolish, most of the most important kinds of badness that plague the planet Earth. We would do what previous generations, who were all sinners, have all failed to do, because they were all sinners, which is to make this world a better place. And if the name has already been changed, then let's just change it again. Because after all, the changed name celebrates sin, just as much as the original name used to. The Edge of the Circle. William Wildblood. The UK is currently going through one of its periodic political crises when the powers that be decide to swap one their indentured servants for another in the hope that the public's dissatisfaction with its controllers will be ameliorated and everyone can start looking forward to a bright new future when everything will be different. It's one of those occasions when tragedy and comedy are hard to prize apart. When will we learn that nothing can be changed for the better by politics or social action or anything that people actually do? Perhaps at one time that was not the case, but it certainly is now. The state of our Western civilization has reached the point at which everything external has been corrupted, and anyone who climbs to the top of the greasy pole will have had to compromise their soul in some way or another. No exceptions. As I always say, this is not a counsel of despair or a reason to do nothing. It simply means that the source of the rot is spiritual, and the remedy must also be spiritual first and foremost before anything else can change. If the root of the problem is not addressed, then nothing will change and things will continue to decay. Therefore we must ignore what goes on at the edge of the circle. We must return to the center, for only then will external issues start to correct themselves. Changing yourself is the most radical political action you can take. Not your ideas, though those too, but your very self, which must be reoriented to God. Package deal Christianity is too much for a convert to swallow. Bruce Charlton. It has long been recognized in some circles that, in a deep sense, nearly all serious and real Christians nowadays are converts. They have to be, because mainstream Christianity is so feeble, so shallow, so materialistic. What follows therefore references only real serious Christian churches, not the liberal kind, which organizations are just variants on Christian-themed social club charity fundraisers, plus less or more left activism. But the Christianity of the churches, all of the churches, is just too much for a convert to believe. By which I mean there is just so much of it, such a complexity and range of stuff, that it would take years to learn, and even longer to assimilate, even assuming that you haven't forgotten the early things, before you get around to the later ones. Of course almost nobody takes the time, or makes that effort, and many, most, are simply not capable of it. So, what we get instead, is a commitment to believe and live by, or try to live by, whatever the religious authorities tell us is essential for us to believe. Converts do not know what it is they are supposed to believe. Also, there is a lot of stuff that converts are meant to believe, but tacitly ignore, or nuance away into insignificance. This includes much, or most, of what converts are officially supposed to have sworn to. For instance, priests of Episcopal Christian churches have been sacked when they insisted on acting upon everything that they have solemnly sworn to uphold, during their ordinations. What this amounts to is that, traditional, orthodox, church Christianity is a package deal, and the deal is a very large package. A package deal to which converts sign up, in ignorance of what they are signing. Church Christians never read all the small print before they put their mark on the conversion contract, neither do they understand the official, technical, legal and bureaucratic meanings of all the major contractual terms. Nonetheless, the way church Christianity works is that converts are expected to believe in whatever the terms technically mean, and obey even the small print, as and when such matters become relevant to the church, but not necessarily otherwise. The convert signs up for the package deal, and takes the charter flight to another country, but if, after arriving at the destination, he dislikes the accommodation or the food or the other travelers, well, he has already agreed to accept it, and it is now too late. It is all or nothing, where that all is almost wholly, in practice, a matter of obedience to church authority. Of course, nowadays, those converts who discover later that they don't like what they signed up for, and who are told it is all or nothing, simply leave the church. In droves. The convert to church Christianity might join another church, but whatever their diversity, all serious Christian churches are united in declaring that their own particular understanding of Christianity is that it just is a package deal. The Christian seeker has a wide choice of churches, but wherever he look, the churches offer only package deals, and, though very different from each other, all the packages are so large and so complex that there is always something, many things, he does not know, or cannot honestly and rigorously endorse. This is because traditional Christianity always has been conceptualized as a package deal. Indeed, it seems that almost all men of the past necessarily conceptualized all possible religion in a social and institutional way. But people now do not feel this necessity, and indeed usually feel something almost the opposite, that a meaningful religion needs to be known, understood, and personally endorsed in all of its aspects. This is why I regard it as imperative that Christianity must be understood in brief and simple terms, as having an essence, and therefore not as a large and complex package. An example of this is when early Christians discovered that the religions they had signed up to insisted that every person who was not correctly baptized into the correct church would inevitably, by logical implication, be tormented unbearably forever in hell, and that this applied to everyone born before Christ, or in not Christian nations and places, and all the wisest and most virtuous pagans of antiquity, even Aristotle, and to newborn babies and children. This seemingly stark necessity of the creation of a wholly loving and omnipotent God and the good news of Christ's salvation was later nuanced away or ameliorated in most churches and most places. Nonetheless, it has been a vital component of the Christian church package deal for many people in several times and places.